Welcome to Her True Stories, where we share the most powerful tales of women who refuse to be broken. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means everything to us. The first thing that hit me wasn't the pain, it was the smell. That sterile, antiseptic scent that screams hospital, louder than any siren ever could. My name is Ariel Whitford, and at 67 years old, I thought I'd seen every kind of betrayal life could throw at me. I was wrong. The fluorescent lights above me buzzed like angry wasps as I forced my eyes open. Everything felt heavy, my eyelids, my limbs, even my thoughts moved through what felt like thick molasses. The beeping of machines around me confirmed what I already suspected. I was lucky to be alive. "She's waking up," a voice announced with the kind of forced cheer that made my skin crawl. I turned my head, a monumental effort that sent shooting pains down my neck, and saw my son Marcus standing beside my bed. At 38, Marcus had always been what people generously called ambitious. What they didn't say out loud was that his ambition had always been coupled with a disturbing lack of moral boundaries. Behind him stood his wife, Victoria, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against her designer handbag. Even in a hospital room, she looked like she'd stepped off the pages of a fashion magazine. But then again, Victoria had always cared more about appearances than substance. "Mom," Marcus said, his voice dripping with practiced concern. "You scared us. The doctors weren't sure you were going to make it." I tried to speak, but my throat felt like I'd been swallowing sandpaper. The last clear memory I had was sitting in my penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, sipping tea and reading. Then nothing. A void where hours, maybe days, should have been. "What happened?" I managed to croak. Marcus and Victoria exchanged a look. In my 30-plus years of reading students' faces, I'd learned to recognize guilt. It was written all over both of them. "You had a stroke, Mom," Marcus said, settling into the chair beside my bed like he owned the place. "A severe one. You've been unconscious for 5 days." 5 days. The number echoed in my head like a death knell. 5 days of my life, gone. 5 days during which anything could have happened. "The doctors say you're lucky to be alive," Victoria added, though her tone suggested she might have preferred a different outcome. "At your age, strokes like this are often final." There was something in the way she said "at your age" that made my blood run cold, like she was already measuring me for a coffin. "But don't worry about anything," Marcus continued, pulling out a manila folder from his briefcase. "While you were recovering, Victoria and I took care of everything. All the paperwork, all the arrangements. We didn't want you to have any stress when you woke up." That phrase, "took care of everything," sent alarm bells ringing in my head. In my experience, when someone says they've taken care of everything without your knowledge or consent, they've usually taken care of themselves at your expense. "What kind of arrangements?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I didn't want to know the answer. Marcus opened the folder with the flourish of a magician about to reveal his greatest trick. "Well, given your condition and the doctor's recommendations about avoiding stress, we sold the penthouse." The words hit me like a physical blow. For a moment, I wondered if I was still unconscious, trapped in some nightmare version of reality. My penthouse, my sanctuary, my home of 23 years, the place where I'd planned to spend whatever years remained to me, sold? "I'm sorry, what?" I whispered. "The Central Park penthouse," Victoria clarified, as if there might be confusion about which multi-million-dollar property we were discussing. "The sale closed yesterday. We got an excellent price." My mind reeled. That penthouse wasn't just real estate, it was my life. Every room held memories of my late husband Charles, of raising Marcus, of the life I'd built through decades of hard work as a university professor and later as a successful art consultant. It was where I'd planned to live out my remaining years, surrounded by my books, my art collection, and the view of the park that had sustained me through the darkest moments of my life. "That's impossible," I said, my voice gaining strength from sheer outrage. "I never authorized any sale." Marcus produced a document from his folder, pointing to a signature that bore some vague resemblance to my handwriting, if you squinted and had consumed a significant amount of alcohol. "Actually, you did. Right here," he said smoothly. The doctor explained that memory issues are completely normal after this type of brain trauma. Short-term memory loss, confusion about recent events. I stared at the signature, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew to be true. I had absolutely no memory of signing anything. But then again, I also had no memory of the past week. "You're probably feeling disoriented," Marcus continued with professional sympathy. "It's understandable. That's why we handled this for you. The money from the sale will ensure you get the best care possible," Victoria explained, though her idea of care had always been suspiciously self-serving. "We've found a lovely facility in New Jersey that specializes in post-stroke recovery." New Jersey, miles from the city I loved, from everything familiar. I felt like I was drowning in their smooth explanations and concerned expressions. "I don't understand," I said slowly. "Why didn't you wait until I was conscious to discuss this?" Another loaded glance between them. "The market timing was perfect," Marcus replied. "And honestly, Mom, we weren't sure if you were going to, well, the doctors weren't optimistic." The implication hung in the air like a toxic cloud. They'd sold my home because they thought I was going to die. And maybe, just maybe, they'd been hoping I would. Something was crystallizing in my mind. Not quite suspicion yet, but a growing awareness that this conversation was following a script I hadn't been given a copy of. "How long will I be in this facility?" I asked. "As long as it takes for you to recover," Marcus said. "These things can take time. Months, sometimes years." Years. The word echoed in my head. They were planning to warehouse me in some facility for years while they, what? Enjoyed the proceeds from selling my life? I closed my eyes, trying to process this information through the fog of medication and confusion. When I opened them again, both Marcus and Victoria were watching me with expressions that might have been concern if you didn't look too closely. "I think I need some time to rest," I said finally. "Of course," Marcus said, leaning down to kiss my forehead with all the warmth of a politician greeting voters. "We'll let you sleep." As they gathered their papers and prepared to leave, I caught sight of something that made my blood freeze despite the warm hospital air. Marcus's briefcase was monogrammed with his initials, but what caught my attention was the small logo underneath. Whitford and Associates, Real Estate Law. My son wasn't just any lawyer. He specialized in real estate transactions. And apparently, he'd just completed a very significant one while I was unconscious. The pieces weren't quite fitting together yet, but I had the distinct feeling that I was going to need every bit of the intelligence that had carried me through 40 years of university politics and high-stakes art deals to figure out exactly what game was being played here, and whether I was the player or the prize. Sleep eluded me like a solution to a particularly vexing puzzle. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Marcus's monogrammed briefcase and that smooth signature that was supposed to be mine. By the time morning light filtered through the hospital blinds, I'd made a decision. If someone was playing games with my life, I was going to learn the rules. And then I was going to destroy them at their own game. A new nurse appeared with my breakfast, a cheerful woman whose badge identified her as Carmen Rodriguez, RN. She had the kind of confident, no-nonsense demeanor I'd always appreciated in both medical professionals and graduate students. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitford. How are we feeling today?" "Like someone who's been informed her penthouse was sold while she was unconscious," I replied, which is either remarkably efficient family management or something considerably more problematic. Carmen paused in her adjustment of my four, her professional smile shifting to something more genuine. That does sound unusual. Real estate transactions typically require the actual presence of the property owner. One would think so. She busied herself with checking my vitals, but I caught her glancing at my chart with the kind of attention that suggested she was reading between the lines. After decades in academia, I'd learned to recognize intelligence when I saw it. Mrs. Whitford, she said quietly, in my experience, family members who handle major financial decisions for incapacitated relatives usually discuss those decisions with medical staff to ensure they align with treatment plans and recovery timelines. And did they discuss this with medical staff? Not that I'm aware of. Carmen finished her checks and moved closer to my bed. I've been a nurse here for 12 years. I've seen situations where patients' families make decisions that aren't necessarily in the patient's best interest. The delicate way she phrased this told me everything I needed to know about Carmen's experience with family dynamics in medical crises. What would you advise someone in such a situation? I asked. I'd advise them to request copies of all documents, to understand their legal rights, and to seek independent counsel if anything seems questionable. She paused. I'd also suggest they might want to review their medical records to understand exactly what happened before their stroke. After Carmen left, I lay staring at the ceiling, trying to reconstruct the events leading up to my collapse. The memories were frustratingly hazy, but certain details began to emerge like photographs developing in a dark room. Marcus had been visiting more frequently in recent weeks, always with some excuse, checking on my well-being, bringing groceries, insisting on organizing my medications. At the time, I'd attributed his attention to genuine concern, though it had struck me as slightly out of character for someone who'd previously shown little interest in his mother's daily routine. And I had been feeling increasingly unwell. Headaches, dizziness, confusion that I'd attributed to aging, and the stress of living alone. Now, looking back, the timing seemed suspiciously coincidental with Marcus's increased attentiveness. When Marcus and Victoria returned that afternoon, I was ready with questions. I've been thinking about the penthouse sale. I began without preamble. I'd like to understand the timeline better. Marcus settled into the visitor's chair with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to explaining complex transactions to confused clients. Of course. What would you like to know? When exactly did I supposedly sign the papers? 3 days before your stroke, he replied smoothly. You called me, said you'd been thinking about downsizing, asked me to prepare the documents. And I signed them where? At your apartment. I brought them by. We reviewed everything together. You signed them in my presence. The story was plausible, professionally presented, and felt completely wrong. Not because I couldn't imagine wanting to sell the penthouse. At 67, I could see the logic in downsizing, but because every instinct I developed over decades of evaluating people was telling me this explanation had been rehearsed. I'm curious about something, I said. You're a real estate attorney, but you've never mentioned that specialization in all the years I've known you. A barely perceptible tension appeared around Marcus's eyes. It didn't seem relevant to family conversations. Except when your mother needed to sell her penthouse during a medical emergency. Mom, Victoria interjected, Marcus's expertise has been a blessing. Can you imagine trying to navigate this without someone who understands the legal complexities? I looked at my daughter-in-law. Really looked at her. Victoria had always been beautiful, but there was something different about her appearance lately. New jewelry, more expensive clothes, a general polish that suggested recent financial improvement. You're right, I said finally. It's fortunate that Marcus was available to handle everything so efficiently. They relaxed slightly, apparently interpreting my words as acceptance rather than the growing suspicion they actually represented. After they left, Carmen returned with my evening medications. How was your visit? She asked. Educational, I replied. Tell me, Carmen, in your professional experience, how common is it for people to make major life changes immediately before suffering serious medical emergencies? Carmen's expression grew thoughtful. In my experience, Mrs. Whitford, coincidences in medical situations are often worth examining more closely. That night, as I lay listening to the sounds of the hospital around me, I made another decision. If Marcus and Victoria thought they were dealing with a confused elderly woman who could be managed with smooth explanations and concerned expressions, they were about to discover how wrong they were. 40 years of academic politics had taught me that the most dangerous opponents were often the ones who smiled while they sharpened their knives behind their backs. Time to remind them that age hadn't made me stupid. It had just made me more dangerous. The next morning brought Dr. Sarachin, a neurologist with the kind of sharp intelligence that reminded me of my best graduate students. She reviewed my chart with the thoroughness of someone who actually read the fine print instead of just skimming for billable procedures. "Mrs. Whitford," she said, settling into the chair beside my bed, "I want to discuss your medical history before the stroke. Can you walk me through what medications you were taking regularly?" "Blood pressure medication, lisinopril, I believe. A daily multivitamin. Occasional ibuprofen for joint pain." I paused, trying to remember. "And recently, Marcus had been bringing me some additional supplements. Said they might help with the fatigue I'd been experiencing." Dr. Chun made careful notes. "Do you remember what these supplements were?" "He said they were a combination of vitamins and minerals. They came in unmarked capsules, which I thought was odd, but Marcus explained that his doctor recommended a specific formulation from a compounding pharmacy." "And when did you start taking these?" "Perhaps 6 weeks ago. Marcus was very insistent that they would help with my energy levels and cognitive function." Dr. Chen's pen stopped moving. "Your medical records show that your blood pressure has been well controlled for years, and your cognitive function has been excellent for someone your age. What made Marcus think you needed additional supplementation?" "That was an excellent question. He mentioned that my readings seemed elevated when he checked them during his visits. He'd brought a home monitor, said he wanted to make sure I was staying healthy." "And you felt comfortable taking unmarked supplements based on these readings?" When she put it that way, it sounded remarkably naive. "Marcus is a professional. I assumed he consulted with medical experts." Dr. Chun closed my chart and fixed me with a direct gaze. "Mrs. Whitford, I'm going to order some additional blood work. I want to check for any residual substances that might have contributed to your cardiovascular event." "You think the supplements caused my stroke?" "I think it's worth investigating whether what you were taking was actually supplements." After Dr. Chen left, I found myself replaying every interaction with Marcus over the past 2 months. His sudden interest in my health, the home blood pressure monitoring, the unmarked capsules he'd insisted would help me feel better. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that I'd been feeling progressively worse since starting Marcus's supplements, not better. The fatigue had increased. The confusion had worsened. By the week before my collapse, I'd been having trouble concentrating on simple tasks like reading or balancing my checkbook. Carmen appeared for my afternoon medication round, and I decided to test a theory. "Carmen, in your experience, what would happen if someone took too much blood pressure medication over an extended period?" "Dangerous hypotension, confusion, dizziness, potential cardiovascular complications." She paused in her preparation of my pills. "Why do you ask?" "Academic curiosity." Carmen studied my face with the expression of someone who'd heard that phrase before in much less academic contexts. "Mrs. Whitford, if you're concerned about any medications you were taking before your admission, Dr. Chun has ordered comprehensive toxicology screening. We'll know within 48 hours if there's anything unusual in your system." That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. My sister Catherine stood in the doorway, looking like an avenging angel in a Chanel suit. At 64, Catherine retained the sharp-eyed intensity that had made her one of Manhattan's most feared corporate attorneys before her retirement. "Ariel," she said, embracing me carefully. "I came as soon as I heard. I didn't know Marcus had called you."
He didn't.
"I heard about your situation through other channels." Catherine's tone suggested those channels had been legal rather than familial. "I understand there have been some significant changes in your circumstances." "You could say that." Catherine pulled out a legal pad with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent 40 years taking notes that could later be used to destroy opposing counsel. "Tell me everything." I described the penthouse sale, Marcus's role as real estate attorney, the mysterious supplements, and my growing certainty that the signature on the sales documents wasn't mine. Catherine listened without interruption, making occasional notes that looked like they could be used to plan either a legal strategy or a military campaign. "Ariel," she said when I finished, "how long has it been since we discussed the arrangements we made after Charles died?" "Charles, my late husband, Marcus's father." "The arrangements?" I felt something click into place in my memory. "The trust," I said slowly. "The irrevocable trust," Catherine confirmed. "Established 12 years ago, naming me as trustee, with you having lifetime residency rights but no power to sell or transfer the property." The room seemed to tilt slightly as the implications became clear. They can't sell what they don't own.
Exactly.
The penthouse has been owned by the Catherine Whitford Trust since 2011. You couldn't sell it even if you wanted to, because you're not the legal owner. I stared at my sister, feeling pieces of a very complex puzzle suddenly arranging themselves into a pattern that was both infuriating and oddly satisfying. So their sale is completely invalid? Fraudulent, actually, since Marcus would have known from any proper title search that you don't hold clear ownership. Catherine smiled with the expression she'd once worn while explaining to opposing counsel exactly how thoroughly they'd been outmaneuvered. "It appears," she continued, "that your son has involved himself in a real estate transaction that's not just unethical, it's criminal." The door opened, and Carmen entered with my evening medications. She took one look at Catherine's legal pad and my expression, and immediately understood that the dynamic in the room had shifted dramatically. "Mrs. Whitford," she said quietly, "Dr. Chen wanted me to let you know that your toxicology results will be available tomorrow morning. She'll be discussing them with you personally." After Carmen left, Catherine leaned forward with the focused intensity of a predator who'd just spotted prey. "Ariel, I think it's time we had a conversation with Marcus about his real estate expertise. Specifically, about how he managed to sell property he had no legal right to transfer." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that we give him an opportunity to explain his actions before we involve law enforcement." Catherine's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Unless, of course, he'd prefer to explain them to a grand jury." Dr. Chen arrived the next morning with the expression of someone who'd found exactly what she'd been looking for, even though she'd hoped to be wrong. She closed the door behind her and pulled up a chair beside my bed. "Mrs. Whitford, your toxicology results show elevated levels of blood pressure medication in your system. Significantly elevated levels." "How significantly?" "Levels that would typically require emergency medical intervention. Combined with your age and existing health factors, this concentration of medication could easily trigger the type of cardiovascular event you experienced." I absorbed this information with the peculiar calm that comes from having your worst suspicions confirmed. So Marcus's supplements were actually my blood pressure medication in higher doses? That would be my professional assessment. What you thought were vitamins were likely your prescribed lisinopril in concentrated form, possibly combined with additional blood pressure medications. Catherine, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, leaned forward with the focused attention of someone hearing potential criminal evidence. "Doctor, in your professional opinion, could this have been accidental?" Dr. Chen chose her words carefully. "The levels we found would require deliberate, sustained administration of multiple medications over several weeks. This wasn't a simple medication error. It was attempted murder, I said flatly. I can't make that determination, Dr. Chen replied. But I can tell you that what happened to you was not natural, and it was not accidental. After Dr. Chen left, Catherine and I sat in silence for several minutes, processing the implications of what we'd just learned. We need to call the police, Catherine said finally. Not yet. I was thinking like a professor again, analyzing all variables before drawing conclusions. We need more information. Marcus may have been slowly poisoning me, but we still don't understand his endgame. If he knew he couldn't legally sell the penthouse, what was his plan? Maybe he didn't know about the trust. I shook my head. Marcus is a real estate attorney. Checking title ownership is basic due diligence. He had to know the penthouse was a mine to sell. Then what was he planning? Before I could answer, the door opened and Marcus entered with his usual perfectly pressed suit and concerned son expression. Today, however, I noticed details I'd previously overlooked: the expensive watch, the Italian leather shoes, the subtle but unmistakable signs of someone who'd recently had access to significant money. Mom, how are you feeling today? Much clearer, thank you. In fact, Catherine and I have been discussing some very interesting legal questions about property ownership. Marcus's smile flickered almost imperceptibly. Oh,
Yes.
it seems there's been some confusion about the penthouse sale. Catherine was just explaining that the property isn't actually mine to sell. The color drained from Marcus's face like water from a broken pipe. What do you mean? Catherine spoke with the crisp precision of someone delivering particularly devastating news in a boardroom. I mean, the penthouse has been held in an irrevocable trust for 12 years. Ariel has lifetime residency rights, but I'm the trustee with sole authority over any sale or transfer. Marcus sat down heavily in the visitor's chair. That's impossible. I did a complete title search. The records show clear ownership. Then perhaps you could show us this title search, Catherine suggested sweetly, along with the purchase agreement, the closing documents, and the disbursement records for the sale proceeds. Those documents are confidential attorney work product. Not when they involve my client's property, Catherine interrupted, or when they may constitute evidence of real estate fraud. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Marcus looked between Catherine and me, clearly recalculating whatever strategy he'd planned for this conversation. Mom, he said, focusing on me with what he probably thought was persuasive sincerity, I think there's been a serious miscommunication. If there are any title issues, we can certainly resolve them. Marcus, I interrupted gently, I think it's time we discussed your supplement recommendations. He went very still. My what? The vitamins you've been bringing me. Dr. Chen found them quite interesting from a pharmaceutical perspective. The silence that followed was profound. Marcus's face had gone completely white. What about the vitamins? He asked weakly. It turns out they weren't vitamins, I explained, my voice growing stronger with each word. They were concentrated doses of blood pressure medication. Enough to cause exactly the type of cardiovascular emergency that brought me here. Marcus shot to his feet, his professional composure finally cracking completely. That's impossible. Mom, you must be confused about what you were taking. The toxicology report was quite specific, Catherine interjected. Would you like me to read the relevant sections? I think there's been a serious misunderstanding here, Marcus said quickly. Ariel, you've been under tremendous stress, and after a brain injury, memory can be unreliable. Are you suggesting I imagine taking the pills you brought me? I asked with genuine curiosity. I'm suggesting that traumatic brain injuries can affect perception and memory in ways that make patients unreliable witnesses to their own experiences. It was a clever legal strategy, question the victim's competence to remember events. Unfortunately for Marcus, he was dealing with someone who'd spent 40 years listening to creative excuses from graduate students and manipulative colleagues. Marcus, I said with a patient tone I'd once used for particularly slow learners. You're a real estate attorney who attempted to sell property you knew you didn't have clear title to, using forged documents, while systematically poisoning the supposed seller to ensure she couldn't interfere with your scheme. His face progressed from white to an interesting shade of purple. The only question I have, I continued, is whether you actually thought you could get away with this, or whether you're simply not as intelligent as your law degree suggests. You can't prove any of this, Marcus said desperately. Actually, Carmen said from the doorway, we can. We all turned to find Carmen standing there with what appeared to be a small recording device. Massachusetts is a one-party consent state for recordings, she explained helpfully. And hospital policy requires documentation of suspected elder abuse situations. Marcus looked around the room like a trapped animal seeking an escape route. This is entrapment. This is evidence, Catherine corrected, of attempted murder, real estate fraud, elder abuse, and probably several other felonies we haven't thought of yet. I want a lawyer, Marcus said. An excellent idea. I agreed, my voice cold as winter steel. You're going to need a very good one. As Carmen called security and Catherine began making notes about criminal referrals, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the pure, unadulterated satisfaction of watching a predator realize they'd chosen the wrong prey. My son had tried to kill me for money. Now he was about to learn that some lessons are very expensive indeed. The next morning brought Detective Sarah Morgan, a compact woman with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone who'd seen enough family dysfunction to find very little shocking. Carmen had called the police after our recorded conversation with Marcus, and Detective Morgan had spent the night reviewing what she described as one of the more creative elder abuse cases she'd encountered. Mrs. Whitford, she began, settling into the visitor's chair with a notepad, I need to understand the timeline of events leading up to your hospitalization. I walked her through Marcus's increased attention over the past 2 months, the mysterious supplements, my deteriorating health, and the conveniently timed penthouse sale. Detective Morgan took detailed notes, occasionally asking for clarification on dates or specific incidents. We arrested your son early this morning, she said matter-of-factly. He's being held on charges of attempted murder, real estate fraud, and elder abuse. His wife, Victoria, has also been brought in for questioning. A surge of satisfaction ran through me. What did they say? Marcus is claiming this is all a misunderstanding. Victoria is claiming she had no knowledge of any fraudulent activities. Detective Morgan's expression suggested she found both claims equally unconvincing. What about the money from the supposed sale? That's where things get interesting. It appears Marcus convinced a legitimate buyer to transfer funds into an escrow account he controlled, promising that minor title issues would be resolved within a few weeks. Catherine leaned forward. How much money are we talking about? $4.7 million. I felt the blood drain from my face. My penthouse was worth significant money, but I'd never imagined it had appreciated to nearly $5 million. Where is that money now? I asked. Detective Morgan consulted her notes. Marcus and Victoria have been living quite well these past few weeks. New cars, expensive jewelry, a boat, and what appears to be a significant gambling habit. We're still tracking all the expenditures, but it looks like they've spent or hidden approximately $2 million. The scope of their betrayal was staggering. They hadn't just tried to kill me. They'd already been living off the proceeds of their crime, celebrating what they thought was my imminent death. There's something else, Detective Morgan continued. We've discovered that this wasn't Marcus's first attempt at this type of fraud. We found evidence of at least 3 other elderly clients who signed over property rights under questionable circumstances. Other victims? I asked. 2 are still alive and willing to testify. 1 died 6 months ago under circumstances that are now being reinvestigated. The room fell silent as we processed the implications. Marcus hadn't just targeted me. He'd built a criminal enterprise based on exploiting vulnerable elderly people. Mrs. Whitford, Detective Morgan said, I want you to know that the district attorney's office is treating this as a priority case. Your son is looking at significant prison time. After Detective Morgan left, Catherine and I found ourselves alone for the first time since this nightmare began. How are you feeling? She asked. Furious, I replied without hesitation, but also liberated. Liberated? For months, I've been questioning my own judgment, wondering if I was becoming senile or paranoid. Now I know that every instinct I had was correct. Marcus was systematically destroying my health and stealing my life. Catherine smiled grimly. What do you want to do about it? I want to destroy him the same way he tried to destroy me. Methodically.
Completely.
And I want him to see it coming. That afternoon brought James Harrington, a criminal defense attorney who specialized in elder abuse cases. Catherine had called him at my request, not to defend Marcus, but to ensure that our civil case against him would be airtight. Mrs. Whitford, James said after reviewing the case materials, you have grounds for a civil suit that could recover not just the stolen money, but significant punitive damages. We're talking about a case that could financially destroy your son for the rest of his life. Good, I said firmly. What else? We can also pursue professional sanctions that would result in his disbarment. A lawyer who uses his expertise to defraud clients will never practice law again. Even better. What else? James looked at Catherine, then back at me. With your permission, I'd like to coordinate with the prosecutor to ensure that Marcus receives the maximum possible sentence. Given the systematic nature of his crimes and the other victims involved, we're looking at potential life imprisonment. I considered this for a moment. Life imprisonment seemed almost too merciful for someone who'd tried to murder his own mother for money.
Do it, I said.
All of it. I want Marcus to lose everything, his freedom, his career, his reputation, his future. I want him to understand exactly what it feels like to have your life destroyed by someone you trusted. That evening, as I sat alone in my hospital room, I realized something profound had changed within me. The confused, vulnerable woman who'd awakened a week ago was gone. In her place was someone harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. Marcus had tried to kill me because he thought I was weak. He was about to learn that survival had a way of stripping away everything soft and leaving only the steel beneath. The war was just beginning, and I intended to win it. 2 weeks after Marcus's arrest, I was finally discharged from the hospital. But instead of going to some dreary facility in New Jersey, I was returning to my penthouse. My legally protected, untouchable penthouse that Catherine's trust had ensured no one could steal from me. The first thing I did was change every lock, security code, and access protocol. The second thing I did was hire the best private investigator in New York City. Thomas Blackwood came recommended by Catherine as someone who specialized in financial crimes and had a particular talent for uncovering hidden assets. At 62, he had the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades looking into the dark corners of human nature and finding exactly what he expected to find. Mrs. Whitford, he said, settling into my living room with a cup of coffee and a thick file, your son and daughter-in-law have been very busy with your money. Show me everything. Thomas spread photographs and financial documents across my coffee table like he was dealing cards. After the fraudulent sale went through, they immediately began transferring money into multiple accounts. Offshore holdings, cryptocurrency, precious metals, real estate investments in other states. I studied the documents, recognizing the hallmarks of someone who'd planned this theft very carefully. How much have they hidden? We've tracked approximately $3.2 million so far. The remaining $1.5 million was spent on luxury items and what appears to be a significant gambling problem. Gambling? High-stakes poker games, private casino visits, sports betting. Your son had apparently developed quite an expensive habit. The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus had tried to kill me to fund his gambling addiction. Now those same impulses were going to help me destroy him. What about their assets? I asked. Significant. The boat they purchased is worth $400,000. Victoria's jewelry collection is valued at around $200,000. They also made a down payment on a vacation home in the Hamptons. I leaned back in my chair, processing this information. Can we seize all of it? Every last dollar, Thomas confirmed. Since all their recent wealth came from criminal activity, it's subject to civil forfeiture. Plus, you can sue for punitive damages that could attach their future earnings for decades.
Do it.
I want them to lose everything they gained from trying to murder me. Thomas smiled with the satisfaction of someone who enjoyed bringing justice to people who thought they were too clever to face consequences. There's more. Marcus's law firm is facing a complete investigation. 3 other partners are being investigated for their involvement in his fraudulent schemes. The firm will likely be dissolved, and their professional malpractice insurance is already refusing to cover criminal acts. So Marcus's entire professional network is collapsing. Like a house of cards. His law license has been suspended pending criminal proceedings, and the State Bar Association is pursuing permanent disbarment. Even if he somehow avoided prison time, he'd never practice law again. But prison time wasn't in question. The district attorney had made it clear that Marcus was facing multiple felony charges that carried mandatory minimum sentences. With the evidence we'd gathered, conviction was virtually guaranteed. What about Victoria? I asked. Thomas flipped to another section of his file. Interesting story there. Turns out she's been having an affair with Marcus's business partner, David Chen. They were planning to leave Marcus once the money from your penthouse was fully liquidated. The betrayal within the betrayal was almost poetic. Marcus had destroyed his relationship with his mother to steal money that his wife was planning to steal from him. Do you have proof of this affair? Photos, hotel receipts, text messages. Victoria's lawyer is trying to claim she was an innocent victim of Marcus's schemes, but the evidence suggests she was an active participant who was planning her own exit strategy. I studied the photographs Thomas had taken of Victoria and David Chen embracing outside an expensive hotel. The irony was exquisite. While Marcus was slowly poisoning me to steal my home, his wife was planning to abandon him with the proceeds. I want to make sure Victoria faces the same consequences as Marcus, I said firmly. She may not have been the mastermind, but she was a willing participant who benefited from attempted murder. Already in motion. The prosecution is offering her a plea deal, full cooperation and testimony against Marcus in exchange for a reduced sentence. But given the evidence of her affair and her active participation in spending the stolen money, she's still looking at significant prison time. That afternoon, Catherine arrived with updates from the criminal proceedings. Marcus's attorney is trying to negotiate a plea deal, she announced, settling into the chair across from me. He's claiming diminished capacity due to gambling addiction and financial pressure. Absolutely not, I said immediately. I want this to go to trial. I want every detail of what he did to be made public. I want his reputation destroyed as thoroughly as he tried to destroy my life. Catherine smiled approvingly. I was hoping you'd say that. The prosecutor agrees. This case is going to send a message to anyone else who thinks they can exploit elderly family members. What about the civil suit? James has filed for compensatory damages, punitive damages, and civil forfeiture of all assets purchased with stolen funds. We're seeking $15 million in total damages. The number was staggering, but not unreasonable given the scope of Marcus's crimes. Will we actually recover that much? Probably not in cash, but we'll destroy his ability to ever rebuild his life financially. Even if he serves only 10 years in prison, he'll spend the rest of his life paying restitution he'll never be able to afford. That evening, I stood on my terrace overlooking Central Park, breathing in the cool autumn air. The view that Marcus had tried to steal from me stretched out below, the trees just beginning to turn gold, the reservoir glinting in the late sunlight, the city lights beginning to twinkle in the distance. For the first time in months, I felt truly at peace. Not because the danger was over. Marcus was still awaiting trial, and Victoria was still trying to minimize her role in their crimes. But because I finally understood the full scope of what had been done to me, and I had a plan to ensure that justice would be both swift and complete. Marcus had tried to kill me because he thought I was weak, vulnerable, and easily manipulated. He was about to learn that some prey turns into predator when cornered. The next phase of my revenge was going to be very satisfying indeed. 3 months later, I sat in the front row of a packed courtroom as Marcus's trial began. The media attention had been intense. A story about a lawyer who tried to murder his elderly mother for her penthouse had captured the public imagination in the worst possible way for Marcus. The prosecutor, District Attorney Maria Santos, was a formidable woman in her 50s who had built her career on taking down white-collar criminals who thought their education and social status made them untouchable. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "this case is about the ultimate betrayal. A son who systematically poisoned his own mother, forged legal documents to steal her home, and planned to warehouse her in a facility while he spent the proceeds of his attempted murder." I watched Marcus's face as the prosecutor outlined his crimes in methodical detail. Gone was the smooth confidence he'd once projected. In its place was the hollow-eyed desperation of someone who'd finally realized that his clever schemes had led him to complete ruin. His attorney, Robert Sterling, was one of the most expensive criminal defense lawyers in the city. But even Sterling's reputation couldn't overcome the mountain of evidence we'd assembled. "My client made serious errors in judgment," Sterling argued. "But these were the actions of a man struggling with gambling addiction and financial desperation, not the calculated crimes of a cold-blooded killer." It was a pathetic defense, and the jury's expressions suggested they found it as unconvincing as I did. The prosecution's case was devastating. Dr. Chin testified about the deliberate poisoning. Detective Morgan presented evidence of the fraudulent real estate transaction. Thomas Blackwood detailed the systematic theft and concealment of assets, but the most damaging testimony came from Victoria herself. Marcus's wife had accepted a plea deal in exchange for her cooperation, and she took the stand wearing an orange jumpsuit and the defeated expression of someone who'd lost everything she'd ever cared about. Marcus told me his mother was becoming senile and needed to be placed in care. Victoria testified, her voice barely audible. He said selling the penthouse was necessary to pay for her medical expenses. "But you knew the sale proceeds were being used for other purposes?" the prosecutor asked. "Yes." Marcus said we needed to invest the money to protect it, but we were buying luxury items and gambling. I knew it was wrong, but I was afraid to question him. "Did you know about the supplements Marcus was giving his mother?" Victoria's composure finally cracked. "He told me they were vitamins to help with her confusion. I didn't know he was poisoning her. I swear I didn't know." The jury watched this performance with obvious skepticism. Victoria's tears might have been genuine, but her complicity in spending the stolen money was undeniable. When it was my turn to testify, I looked directly at Marcus as I described his systematic destruction of my health and theft of my home. I wanted him to see in my eyes that I wasn't the confused elderly woman he'd tried to eliminate. Marcus visited me frequently in the weeks before my stroke. I testified. He brought me pills he claimed were supplements, monitored my health with a blood pressure cuff, and insisted on handling my medications. I trusted him because he was my son. "How did you feel when you learned that these supplements were actually concentrated blood pressure medication?" the prosecutor asked.
Betrayed.
Furious, and determined to ensure that no other elderly person would suffer what I suffered. I spent 2 days on the witness stand, calmly and methodically destroying every aspect of Marcus's defense. When his attorney tried to suggest that my memory might be unreliable due to my stroke, I provided detailed documentation of every interaction, every medication, every suspicious conversation. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts, the foreman announced. I watched Marcus's face as the verdict was read. Guilty of attempted murder. Guilty of real estate fraud. Guilty of elder abuse. Guilty of money laundering. Guilty of forgery. He turned to look at me, and for a moment, I saw something that might have been remorse. But it was too late for remorse. The time for mercy had passed the moment he decided to poison his own mother. Judge Patricia Morrison's scheduled sentencing for the following month, but the message was already clear. Marcus was facing life in prison, and there was nothing left of his carefully constructed professional and personal life. After the trial, reporters surrounded me as I left the courthouse. "Mrs. Whitford, how do you feel about your son's conviction?" one asked. "I feel that justice has been served," I replied calmly. "My son tried to murder me for money. Now he'll spend the rest of his life paying for that choice. Do you have any message for other elderly people who might be vulnerable to similar crimes?" I looked directly into the camera, thinking of all the other families who might be dealing with predators like Marcus. Trust your instincts. If someone is making decisions about your life without your input, question everything. And remember that criminals often come disguised as helpful family members. The news coverage was extensive and thoroughly damaging to what remained of Marcus's reputation. His photograph appeared on every local news program and newspaper, identified as the lawyer who tried to kill his mother for her penthouse. That evening, Catherine and I celebrated with champagne in my living room. "To justice," she said, raising her glass. "To revenge," I corrected. Justice would have been preventing Marcus from trying to kill me. Revenge is ensuring he pays for it for the rest of his life. Catherine smiled approvingly. "You've become quite ruthless, haven't you?" "I've become quite clear about what matters," I replied. "And what matters is ensuring that predators face consequences that are severe enough to deter other predators." The criminal trial was over, but my revenge was far from complete. The civil proceedings would ensure that Marcus lost every dollar he'd ever hoped to gain from my death, and I was going to enjoy every moment of his financial destruction. The civil trial began 6 weeks after Marcus's criminal conviction. While he sat in a federal prison awaiting his formal sentencing, I sat in another courtroom, this time seeking to destroy him financially for the rest of his life. James Harrington had assembled a case that was both comprehensive and ruthless. We weren't just seeking to recover the stolen money. We were seeking punitive damages that would ensure Marcus could never rebuild his life, even if he somehow got out of prison before he died. "Your Honor," James addressed Judge William Crawford, "the defendant didn't just commit theft. He committed attempted murder for financial gain, then systematically concealed the proceeds while his victim fought for her life in a hospital bed. This case demands maximum punitive damages to deter similar crimes." Marcus's civil attorney was an overworked public defender who clearly understood that his client's case was hopeless. Marcus himself appeared via video link from prison, wearing an orange jumpsuit and the hollow expression of someone who'd lost everything. The damages we were seeking were staggering. Full restitution of the $4.7 million from the fraudulent sale, plus punitive damages of $15 million, plus seizure of all assets purchased with stolen funds. Thomas Blackwood testified about the systematic concealment of assets, presenting evidence that Marcus had hidden money in offshore accounts, cryptocurrency investments, and precious metals purchases. The defendant clearly planned this theft well in advance, Thomas testified. The sophistication of the money laundering operation suggests months of preparation. Catherine testified about the trust arrangements that had made the entire real estate fraud legally impossible, emphasizing that Marcus's legal expertise meant he knew exactly what laws he was breaking. A real estate attorney who attempts to sell property without clear title isn't making a mistake. she told the court. He's committing a deliberate fraud that he hopes his victims won't discover until it's too late. But the most powerful testimony came from the other victims of Marcus's schemes, elderly clients who had been manipulated into signing over property rights or financial authority they never intended to transfer. Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, 81 years old, testified about how Marcus had convinced her to sign documents that transferred ownership of her family home to a corporation he controlled. He said it was for tax purposes, she testified, her voice shaking with anger. He said I would still live there, but the paperwork would protect my children's inheritance. Instead, he tried to sell my house without telling me. Mr. Robert Chen, 76, described how Marcus had gained power of attorney over his finances, then systematically drained his retirement accounts for investment opportunities that never materialized. I trusted him because he was a lawyer, Mr. Chen said. I thought lawyers were required to act in their clients' best interests. I didn't know that some lawyers are just sophisticated thieves. The pattern was clear. Marcus had built his entire practice around exploiting elderly clients who trusted his professional credentials. I wasn't an isolated victim. I was just the most lucrative target in a systematic criminal enterprise. Judge Crawford was clearly appalled by the scope of Marcus's crimes. Mr. Whitford, he said, addressing Marcus via video link, you have used your legal training to prey upon vulnerable elderly people, including your own mother. This court has rarely seen such a systematic betrayal of professional ethics and family trust. The civil judgment was everything we had hoped for: full restitution, maximum punitive damages, and seizure of all assets purchased with stolen funds. The total judgment was $23.4 million, money that Marcus would never be able to pay, ensuring that he would spend the rest of his life in financial ruin even if he ever got out of prison. But the financial judgment was only part of my revenge. The real satisfaction came from watching Marcus's complete social destruction. The legal proceedings had generated extensive media coverage, and Marcus's name had become synonymous with elder abuse and family betrayal. His former colleagues at the law firm had publicly denounced him and donated money to elder abuse prevention programs to distance themselves from his crimes. Victoria had received a reduced sentence in exchange for her cooperation, but she was still facing 3 years in federal prison and financial ruin. Her affair with Marcus's business partner had been exposed during the trial, destroying her reputation and any sympathy she might have received as a victimized spouse. The business partner, David Chen, was facing his own criminal charges for his role in laundering the stolen money. The entire network of professionals who had enabled Marcus's crimes was being systematically destroyed. That evening, as I reviewed the civil judgment documents, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with the money. The $15 million in punitive damages would likely never be collected. Marcus would die in prison long before he could earn enough to pay even a fraction of what he owed. But that wasn't the point. The point was that Marcus had lost everything: his freedom, his career, his reputation, his family, his future. He had tried to kill me to steal my life, and instead, he had destroyed his own life so completely that death would have been merciful by comparison. I poured myself a glass of wine and stood on my terrace, looking out over the city lights. Somewhere out there, Marcus was sitting in a prison cell, facing the reality that he would spend the rest of his life paying for the decision to poison his own mother. The revenge was complete, but there was one final act I wanted to perform. 6 months after Marcus's sentencing to life in prison without the possibility of parole, I sat in my car outside the federal correctional facility, questioning the wisdom of my decision to accept his request for a visit. I had initially refused all of his attempts to contact me. His letters went unopened into the trash. His phone calls were blocked. I had no interest in hearing his excuses, his apologies, or his attempts to manipulate me one final time. But then Thomas Blackwood had brought me an interesting piece of information. Marcus had been placed in general population rather than protective custody, and word of his crimes had spread among the other inmates. A lawyer who had tried to murder his elderly mother for money was not popular among men who had children and mothers of their own. Marcus had been attacked twice in his first month, requiring medical treatment and solitary confinement for his own protection. He was spending 23 hours a day in a concrete box, alone with the consequences of his choices. It was then that I decided I wanted to see him one final time. Not to forgive him. Forgiveness was neither required nor deserved. But to look him in the eye and ensure that he understood exactly what he had lost and why. The visiting room was designed to be as depressing as possible while still meeting basic human dignity requirements. Marcus sat at a metal table, wearing prison clothing that made him look smaller and older than I remembered. 6 months of incarceration had stripped away the last vestiges of his professional confidence, revealing something broken and defeated underneath. "Mother," he said as I sat across from him, "thank you for coming. I'm not here for your comfort, Marcus. I'm here because I had some things I wanted you to understand." He nodded, clearly choosing his words carefully. Gone was the smooth charm that had once made him so convincing. In its place was something that looked like genuine fear. "I want you to know that I understand what I did was unforgivable," he began. "I tried to kill you for money. I betrayed your trust in the worst possible way." "There's no excuse for—" "Stop," I interrupted. "I didn't come here to listen to your apologies or your self-serving attempts at remorse. I came here to make sure you understand the consequences of your choices." Marcus fell silent, watching me with the wary attention of someone who had finally learned to fear the person he'd once tried to eliminate. "You thought I was weak," I continued, my voice cold and steady. "You thought I was an easy target, a confused elderly woman who could be manipulated and then discarded when she was no longer useful. You were wrong." I leaned forward, holding his gaze. "Do you know what your life looks like now, Marcus? You're serving life without parole in a federal prison where everyone knows you tried to murder your mother. You'll never practice law again. You'll never own property again. You'll never have a normal relationship again. You'll spend the next 30 or 40 years in a concrete box, surrounded by men who despise you for what you did." Marcus's face had gone pale, but I wasn't finished. "Victoria is in federal prison, financially ruined and abandoned by everyone she thought cared about her. Your business partner is facing his own criminal charges. Your law firm has been dissolved. Your professional reputation has been completely destroyed. Everyone who ever knew you now knows you as the man who tried to poison his mother for money." I sat back, studying his expression. "You tried to take everything from me, my life, my home, my dignity. Instead, you lost everything yourself. That's not irony, Marcus. That's justice." "I know," he whispered. "I know I deserve this." "You deserve worse," I replied calmly. "But this will have to suffice." We sat in silence for several minutes. Marcus seemed to be struggling with something, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Finally, he spoke. "Why did you come here? If you're not here to forgive me, why did you want to see me?" I considered the question. "Because I wanted to look you in the eye and make sure you understood that your attempt to destroy me accomplished exactly the opposite of what you intended. You thought killing me would solve your problems. Instead, it destroyed your life so completely that you'll spend the rest of your existence paying for that decision. And I wanted you to know," I continued, "that every day for the rest of your life, you'll wake up in a prison cell and remember that you're there because you were stupid enough to try to kill someone who is smarter, stronger, and more ruthless than you ever imagined." Marcus's composure finally cracked completely. Tears began streaming down his face. Not tears of remorse, but tears of complete despair as the full scope of his situation became clear. "I'm sorry," he sobbed. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I never meant for it to go this far. You meant to kill me, Marcus. You gave me concentrated doses of blood pressure medication for weeks, hoping I would die so you could steal my home. You meant for it to go exactly this far. I stood up, preparing to leave. Goodbye, Marcus. I hope you live a very long life in prison, thinking every day about the choices that brought you here. As I walked away, I heard him calling after me, his voice breaking with desperation. Mom, please. Don't leave me like this. Please. I didn't turn around. Marcus had forfeited any claim to my mercy the moment he'd decided to poison me for money. He would spend the rest of his life learning to live with the consequences of that choice. Outside the prison, I sat in my car for several minutes, processing the emotions of seeing my son reduced to a broken man in an orange jumpsuit. I felt no satisfaction in his tears, no pleasure in his desperation, but I felt a deep, abiding sense of completion. The account was settled. The debt was paid. Justice had been served with a thoroughness that would have impressed the most demanding creditor. I drove home to my penthouse, to the view Marcus had tried to steal, to the life he had tried to end. I was 77 years old, and I had learned that survival wasn't just about enduring. It was about ensuring that predators faced consequences severe enough to deter other predators. Marcus would spend the rest of his life in prison, and I would spend the rest of mine enjoying the freedom he had tried to take from me. Some lessons are expensive, but the education is worth every penny. 2 years after Marcus's conviction, I stood in my penthouse living room, looking out at the Central Park view that had nearly cost me my life. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the space that Marcus had tried to steal and that I had fought to reclaim. The past 24 months had been transformative in ways I never could have imagined. What had begun as a fight for survival had evolved into something much larger, a complete reconstruction of my life based on strength rather than vulnerability, clarity rather than confusion, and purpose rather than mere existence. The financial settlement from the civil case had been fully executed. Every asset Marcus and Victoria had purchased with stolen money had been seized and liquidated. The luxury cars, the jewelry, the boat, the down payment on the Hamptons house, all of it had been converted back to cash and returned to the victims of their schemes. The other elderly clients Marcus had defrauded had received full restitution, plus additional compensation from the punitive damages. Mrs. Thompson had gotten her family home back. Mr. Chun had recovered his retirement savings. 3 other victims had received settlements that allowed them to rebuild the financial security Marcus had stolen from them, but the money had never been the point. The point had been ensuring that Marcus and Victoria faced consequences so severe that other predators would think twice before targeting vulnerable elderly people, and those consequences had been thoroughly delivered. Marcus was serving his life sentence in a federal facility in Pennsylvania, where he spent most of his time in protective custody after repeated attacks from other inmates. His appeals had been denied at every level. His law license had been permanently revoked. His name had become synonymous with elder abuse and family betrayal. Victoria had served 18 months in federal prison and been released to 3 years of supervised probation. She was working as a cashier at a grocery store in Ohio, living in a studio apartment, and paying court-ordered restitution that would keep her in poverty for the rest of her life. Her affair with Marcus's business partner had been exposed during the trial, destroying any possibility of sympathy or social rehabilitation. David Chun, the business partner, had received 5 years in federal prison for money laundering and was facing civil suits from multiple victims. His legal career was over, his reputation destroyed, his marriage ended. The ripple effects of their crimes had destroyed not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone who had enabled or benefited from their criminal enterprise. But perhaps the most satisfying consequence was the complete erasure of Marcus's professional legacy. The law firm bearing his name had been dissolved. The real estate deals he had legitimately completed were being reviewed for potential fraud. 3 other attorneys who had worked with him were facing professional sanctions and criminal investigations. Marcus had spent years building what he thought was a successful career. Now, Every case he had ever worked on was tainted by the knowledge that he was a man who had tried to murder his own mother for money. The media attention had been extensive and universally damaging. Marcus's story had been featured in documentaries about elder abuse, used as a case study in legal ethics courses, and cited in legislation designed to strengthen protections for vulnerable elderly people. His name would live in infamy as a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting family members who viewed elderly relatives as obstacles to wealth rather than people deserving of respect and protection. Today marked the second anniversary of my stroke. The day Marcus had tried to kill me and instead had sealed his own fate. I had decided to commemorate the occasion with a small gathering of the people who had helped me survive and seek justice. Catherine arrived first, bringing champagne and her latest legal war stories. At 66, she had come out of retirement to work on elder abuse cases, using our experience to help other families navigate similar crises. Carmen Rodriguez came next, having left her hospital job to work as a private advocate for elderly patients. She had testified before Congress about the warning signs of family-based abuse and had helped develop training programs for healthcare workers. Thomas Blackwood arrived with a thick file folder, grinning like someone who had just solved a particularly satisfying puzzle. "I brought you a present," he announced, settling into one of my leather chairs. "What kind of present?" "Marcus received some interesting news yesterday. His cellmate has been transferred to a different facility, and his new cellmate is someone who has very strong feelings about men who hurt elderly women." I raised an eyebrow. "Are you suggesting that Marcus's prison experience is about to become even more unpleasant?" "I'm suggesting that consequences have a way of compounding over time, especially for people who make the kind of enemies Marcus has made." Catherine laughed approvingly. "Some people never learn that actions have consequences until the consequences become unavoidable." As the afternoon wore on, we talked about the changes that had emerged from my experience. The legislation that had been passed to strengthen penalties for family-based financial abuse. The training programs that had been developed for healthcare workers and social services personnel. The legal precedents that had been established to make it easier for elderly victims to recover stolen assets. But mostly, we talked about the satisfaction of watching a carefully planned crime result in complete and utter destruction for the criminals involved. "Do you ever regret not accepting Marcus's apology?" Carmen asked as we watched the sunset over Central Park. "Regret requires believing that a different choice would have produced a better outcome," I replied. "Marcus didn't apologize because he was genuinely remorseful. He apologized because he was facing the consequences of his actions and wanted me to make those consequences disappear. And you preferred to let the consequences stand." "I preferred to ensure that the consequences were severe enough to deter other predators from making similar choices." As my guests prepared to leave, Catherine handed me an envelope with a familiar return address. "Another letter from Marcus?" I asked. "The fourth one this month. He's apparently becoming more desperate as his appeals are denied and his situation becomes more challenging." I looked at the envelope, noting the increasingly shaky handwriting. Prison was clearly taking its toll on my former son. "Are you going to read it?" Thomas asked. "No," I said, dropping the letter into the fireplace where it caught immediately. "Marcus forfeited the right to my attention when he decided to poison me for money. His desperation is no longer my concern." After everyone left, I stood alone in my living room, surrounded by the art collection Marcus had tried to steal, looking out at the view he had tried to sell, living in the home he had tried to take from me. At 77, I had learned something profound about survival and revenge. The best revenge wasn't just living well, it was ensuring that the people who tried to destroy you faced consequences so severe that they served as warnings to other predators. Marcus would spend the rest of his life in prison, broke, despised, and alone. Victoria would spend the rest of her life paying restitution she could never afford, working menial jobs to pay for the decision to help murder an elderly woman for money. Their lives had been destroyed as completely as they had tried to destroy mine, but I was still here, still strong, still enjoying the freedom they had tried to steal. I had turned their attempt at murder into their complete destruction, and I had done it with the same methodical precision Marcus had used in planning my death. Some prey, when cornered, discovers it was actually a predator all along. I poured myself a glass of wine and raised it in a toast to my own survival and to the perfect justice of watching criminals destroy themselves through their own choices. Marcus had tried to kill me because he thought I was weak. He had learned, far too late, that some women become more dangerous with age, not less. The revenge was complete, the victory was absolute, and the future was mine to enjoy. I had survived attempted murder and turned it into the complete annihilation of my enemies, a T-77. I was just getting started. Thank you for watching her true stories. If Ariel's story of survival and revenge inspired you, please subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Remember, some women don't get mad. They get even. And when they do, the results are devastating. Until next time, keep fighting for your truth.